Hi, everyone. Welcome. It's so nice to have everyone here today. Just to make sure you're in the right panel, this is the panel about offshore wind. After the panel, you will see a couple of QR codes for CEUs for ASLA and AIA credits. Feel free to just pull up your phone if you'd like to get those credits. But other than that, those are the welcomes, and I will actually just jump into the panel discussion. So my name is Furhana Husani. I am the Director of Programs and Climate Initiatives at Waterfront Alliance. And today, we're going to be talking about offshore wind and many of the challenges that offshore wind has been facing. We know that it's sharpened under the new administration. However, at utility scale, renewable energy has the backing of states, unions, environmental organizations, as well as energy developers. This panel will feature several experts who are essentially leading advocates to a port developer as well as energy developers. They will assess the state of offshore wind nationally, regionally, and how the industry is addressing these challenges, facing these challenges, and talk about a path forward. So it is my honor to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have Clint Plummer from the CEO of Rise Light and Power. We also have Gregory Lampman, who is the Director of Offshore Wind at NYSERDA. And we also have Sam Solistro, who is the Senior VP of Market and Policy Strategy at Oceanic. All of their bios, if you'd like to read them, which they are incredibly intensive and amazing, are all in the app, which I highly recommend you take out and take a look. With that, let's get started. Okay, lots happening in the world of offshore wind. Let's get started with a status update. Sam, would you be able to give us a quick 101 on the executive orders and everything that's been happening with the federal actions?
Sure. Hi, I'm Sam. You may remember me from this morning. So I explained a little bit of what was going on, but to break everything down a little bit further, there's an enduring strength in this industry where states have created policies that are what we call demand drivers or demand signals. So states have set policies that they want to procure 45 gigawatts of offshore wind, and they have planning goals that exceed 116 gigawatts. The federal government is the supply side. They have leased about 60 gigawatts, permitted 20 of it to go to construction, and you can understand that there's a gap between what state demand is and what the federal government has provided. Now we have the added complication where the federal government, being the supply wing of your little economy graph, is now not fulfilling its promises to what it has already permitted. So the executive memorandum that came out does three things functionally. Number one, it prevents future leasing. So we have 60 gigawatts that have been auctioned off or leased. That will be static until the administration either changes its mind or a new administration comes in and there's some sort of act of Congress. Number two, it stops permitting in its place pending a review of the process. That review has no timeline. It has no real quantifiable boundaries to it whatsoever. That has sort of locked the industry in a bit of a status quo. And then number three, it reserves the right to look at existing leases to see if they have the legal authority to amend existing leases, withdraw them, et cetera, et cetera. The biggest complication of this is it is just driving uncertainty in this market right now. So we have projects that have functionally achieved a permitting approval to move forward and are unable to do so because federal government has, I explained it this morning, but went after Atlantic Shores, went after Empire Wind, going after fully permitted projects. So even if you have all your permits, you're not quite sure if you can move forward. And then on top of that, you have a slew of other projects that are somewhere in an environmental review period, and they're stuck where they are. And the only way that they can get unstuck is the clarity out of the federal government about what their review means or some sort of progress towards it. And for us, we're a supply chain organization. We represent 450 companies within the supply chain, and those companies are unable to make investments, or those companies are unable to order new ships or invest in new ports because they have no idea when they're actually going to have a project that will buy their product on the other end. So it has frozen the market. At the same time, we still have activity. So we do have 5 projects under construction right now, 5 commercial scale projects under construction right now. 3 of them are doing major installation offshore right now. 2 of them are doing onshore construction and some offshore construction. And that's 5 gigawatts of activity. That's an enormous amount of activity. And it has created really strong regional markets up in Providence, New Bedford, Massachusetts, down in Virginia, and it has created a supply chain that reaches deep into Louisiana, Ohio, Wisconsin. So it's a weird, I can't remember the terminology. I think I used negative limbo space this morning when I talked about it, but the other side of it is we are also proper title to this panel, which is construction continues. At the same time, we are actually continuing construction.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Greg, I'd love to hear about how things are shaping up in New York. How do you keep things going?
Well, that's a good question. So first, thank you all for the conference. It's nice both to look out these windows. Would you get this in a conference center?
Yeah, we have a nice view from this side.
And also enjoy being surrounded by science types with Waterfront Alliance. So, Greg Lampman, I'm the director of Offshore Wind at NYSERDA. And as Sam started, I think the supply chain folks have an important role to play in this process, but the state has an important role to play in the process. Developers have an important role to play in the process. The environmental groups have an important role to play. The federal and state regulators have an important role to play. So it's really an ecosystem that we're trying to build here. And all the parts of that ecosystem need to function together in order to maximize the benefits and minimize the impacts associated with the development of offshore wind. And that refers to everything from the environmental issues to environmental concerns to cost and cost effectiveness. So for the state, I think one of the key roles that we get to play is a stabilizing force in the process. So sitting at the hub of this hub and spokes of a wheel, we're responsible for the procurements of the offshore wind energy project. So we decide the timing in which those procurements are let, the contract terms associated with them, and how exactly they're designed such that developers are investing in supply chain opportunities or investing in monitoring wildlife or whatever we think are the important factors for consideration in our contracts. So we set the pace for that. We manage the contracts coming out of it. We have 2 contracts now with Sunrise Wind and Empire Wind, both in construction with the pause on the Empire Wind project currently. We also work on a whole host of other issues that try to bring resiliency to the industry and also to de-risk it. So a big part of what goes on with development of an industry of this scale is that you need to figure out how can you take the risks out of the process, and when you take the risks out of the process, you reduce the cost and increase the certainty of that project getting built on the timeline that it's supposed to get built. That certainty is critical for investment in both the projects themselves, in their port infrastructure, in supply chain opportunities, and in the predictability overall. So the state does that, so we've got our key mechanism for managing offshore wind interactions is really around those procurements. But we also work very heavily on the supply chain development. So making investments in supply chain, coordinating with other states, and trying to maximize the use of our supply chains. So we coordinate with other states on that, and the state makes investments. We've got $500 million of state funds that we're investing into the offshore wind supply chain as a way of trying to make sure that we can shore side the value and the workforce and the jobs and the economic investment in the United States. So we do the procurements, we work on supply chain, we try to develop the workforce that can support those projects, both the supply chain project but also the generation projects. We work very closely with the environmental communities on things like marine mammal, understanding marine mammal interactions, understanding fisheries and fisheries interactions, and just trying to really make sure that we collect the data that we need to make that, understand the story and be able to move through the permitting process effectively. And then finally, we spend a lot of time working with state and federal regulators, where we're trying to act as a liaison for our projects to the regulators, so helping the regulators understand how their decisions affect the growth of the industry. But also we work with the developers to make sure they recognize that they need to follow the regulations, otherwise there's going to be lawsuits and problems. So we help with that interpretation back and forth. And then finally, a big component of the projects is the transmission development component. So transmission makes up, roughly 40% of the cost of the overall project. And trying to figure out how you can develop transmission in a way that's predictable and cost-effective is a big part of what we try to work through, both with working in concert with the Public Service Commission and with the New York ISO. So just a quick example, looking at it, the Verrazano, it seems like a pretty big bridge, but when you're trying to run cables underneath the Verrazano Bridge, it's very crowded. So how do you maximize the number of cables coming into and under the Verrazano Bridge and into New York Harbor to interconnect with New York City is one of those challenges. And so we're doing some work with the New York ISO on a public policy transmission need that's going to help develop that transmission. So the state's role, again, is really to be kind of the hub of a lot of this. We set the conditions that help make the project successful. We set the pace in which projects would develop. We support supply chain, workforce development, regulatory processes. But when we designed the program, I always like to throw this in and apologize if you've heard this before, but the tagline for our program is advancing offshore wind in a way that's cost effective and responsible. And the point there is that, one, we're going to move forward, so we are going to build our projects, and the state is dedicated to that goal. We're going to do it in a way that's cost effective, so we're going to consider the impacts on ratepayers and how we can reduce costs and impacts for ratepayers. We want to do it responsibly. So that means we want to make sure that we're environmentally benign, we're working with all the stakeholders in the space to make sure that we're minimizing impacts on them and maximizing benefits. So there's a tension there between going quick, going smart, and extracting as many benefits as you possibly can from the process. So we're always working with stakeholders to understand how to balance that. So we play that center hub in setting those conditions.
That's very helpful, thank you. Clint, going to you. Would love to hear the status of your project and how that's, what's the plan and what's happening now?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you everybody for being here today. My name is Clint Plummer. I'm the CEO of Rise Light and Power. Our company is the owner-operator of the Ravenswood Generating Station, and is also developing a number of new clean energy infrastructure projects around the region. You may have seen yesterday news of a transaction. I'm not going to be talking about that today. You should feel free to ask questions, and I will not answer any of them. Our company, however, has been involved in the offshore wind space for the last 5 years, and before that I spent 13 years in the offshore wind business myself. I was part of the team that developed and built the first offshore wind farm in the United States off the coast of Block Island, and part of the team that developed New York's first offshore wind farm, the South Fork Wind Farm. So I've been around this space approaching 20 years, and my experience in this space has been consistent with what Greg has mentioned, that developers need stability because these projects take a very long time to pull together. In the case of both of those projects that I mentioned, both of which are up and operating today, the timeline for their development spanned multiple federal administrations. In the case of Block Island, we started the development of the project in 2008, and it didn't achieve commercial operations until 2016. So that literally started when George W. Bush was president and was completed after Donald Trump had been elected. We spanned a full Obama. The South Fork Wind Farm started in its earliest incantations in 2010. It didn't get a contract from the Long Island Power Authority until 2017, and it didn't start operations until last year in 2024. So that's 14 years. Each one of those projects required more than 24 separate federal, state, and local permits, consents, entitlements. Each one of those required tens of millions of dollars of capital to be deployed at risk before we had obtained all of those permits, consents, approvals, and other contracts. And the reason that we were willing to do that was because we had conviction on two things. One were fundamental economics. Those fundamental economics are that offshore wind is a very expensive resource and makes no sense anywhere except for where anything else is more expensive and difficult to build. So we look at densely populated urban areas on the coast, like New York City and Long Island, like southern New England, like New Jersey and most of the mid-Atlantic. And in those areas, basically the Boston-Washington corridor and California in the US, and we've got a very significant portion of the US population living in the densest populated areas of the country, and everything is more expensive here. It costs more to build housing. It costs more to build roads here. It costs more to build anything here, and it's practically impossible to build any new form of energy generation in the city of New York, given the constraints on land. And I know that because our company owns and operates the largest generating complex in New York City, and it's very costly. That means that offshore wind, as a resource that is located in the water, can be the most cost-effective new form of generation in these areas. And I know that for a fact, not out of some academic study, but from a pure market-based heads-up competition. The South Fork Wind Farm competed and won in an all-resources solicitation in 2016 in Long Island, where the Long Island Power Authority asked for proposals, technology neutral, for anybody who could deliver energy to the South Fork of Long Island. We competed, new fossil generation competed, new transmission competed, batteries competed, and the South Fork Wind Farm was selected as part of that solicitation because it was the most cost-effective way of delivering energy and renewables to Long Island. And we have the conviction that in these places, that offshore wind can be among the most cost-effective forms of new generation. That's not everywhere, right? In Louisiana, offshore wind is not going to be the cheapest new source of generation. In New York, it will be. So we had conviction and we're willing to spend money based on that. Same thing goes with Block Island and with the other projects we were developing with Deepwater. The other reason that we spent that money was because we had conviction that the state of New York would be a reliable partner for us, and New York has been a reliable partner for the offshore wind industry. The state of New York passed legislation that required the procurement of a certain amount of offshore wind, and NYSERDA has been arguably the nation's leading agency in doing the work that Greg described. I don't think there's another agency in another state that does the work that NYSERDA does to be able to move this industry forward. So we were willing to put that money at risk developing these projects because we knew that there was a fundamental economic need. We knew that we had a reliable partner in the state. Currently, we don't have the same degree of a reliable partner at the federal government. That means that the development of offshore wind is going to go more slowly. That doesn't change the same fundamental economics that drive the need for this. That need is only going to get bigger over time because, as everybody in this room probably knows, the demand for electricity is only going up. If we look at the need for electricity in New York State generally and in downstate particularly, we're seeing load growing at rates that we haven't seen in literally 60 years. That's driven by a confluence of factors, including the electrification of transportation. How many Teslas do you see on the road today? The electrification of space heating. We're moving away from oil and gas and moving towards heat pumps in our homes. And then finally, the rise of the digital infrastructure and the use of AI and data centers putting a significant amount of additional strain on the grid, to say nothing of the state's laudable efforts to bring new manufacturing here with upstate facilities like Micron. So there's a lot of new load coming onto the grid at precisely the time when we need these resources like offshore wind and others. And so our view is that while the federal pause is a regrettable delay, that ultimately the thing that's going to drive the development of these resources is principally the fundamental economics and the need, and that while the federal government is a necessary partner, that the only impact this is going to have is a delay rather than a complete reshuffling of the deck.
It's it's very helpful to get the lay of the land, especially with what's going on regionally as well as nationally. Sam, you used to be known as the business network for offshore wind. Nationally, you are the biggest voice in the industry, and Waterfront Alliance and other advocates, really take a lot of your talking points for advocacy. Give us some counter arguments. What are some of the what are some ways that are effective that could help us sort of make some headway?
I think everything Clint said is the most effective thing to counter with right now, which is we're in an unprecedented time period. The irony of the Trump executive memorandum coming out, stalling offshore wind, was it came the day that he declared an energy emergency at the same time. And that is what is only going to continue driving demand more. And in many ways, we're seeing what is happening, which is offshore wind is almost becoming like a pent-up market once again. You both will remember coming out of the first Trump administration, holding the New York Bight auctions and having unprecedented auction prices because everyone saw the same thing, which is, we're about to get a more regular permitting schedule once again, and money was rushing in to capture those lease areas because they knew that demand was only grew during the slowdown in the first Trump administration. You can look at Virginia to really see this in action right now. So on Clint's first point, which is offshore wind is an economical industry in the right areas. Virginia is building what they call the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project. It is massive. It is probably the second largest offshore wind project in the entire world. And when it's complete in 2 years, ratepayer costs in Virginia are actually going to go down because all other energy sources have gone up in the years that it's taken to build that project. It's $2 on your monthly bill, but it's still a fact that will generate power cheaper than what available power is to the state of Virginia right now. And they are the epicenter of the data center epidemic going on right now, where they're unable to handle the load coming out of demand for new data centers, putting themselves right next to Washington, D.C., and right next to a lot of the military bases. Dominion is a vertically integrated utility. It gets to really decide whatever it wants to build for a new generation. And every single year they keep coming up with, they want more offshore wind and more offshore wind and more offshore wind. So on one end, it's economical. The other unique message the offshore or oceanic can bring is the spread of the economic benefits that the industry also provides. Everywhere we see construction, we see at least 1,000 or 2,000 jobs that are created close to that project center, just from local churn and burn of having boats going out almost every single day, building the ports, building the onshore substations, providing services to the installation activities itself, even if they're not building a new thing. But we also have factories setting up in the Midwest, anticipating the future demand. We have factories in the South starting up. We have shipyards all across the United States that have churned out 50 vessels so far in anticipation for this industry. So we're able to walk into other places far away from the shore and talk about, hey, Wisconsin, you probably don't really care about offshore wind, but you got a shipyard that's putting 600 people to work in building 2 vessels for the offshore wind industry. And if you keep that pipeline of projects going, they'll probably have vessel orders for 5, 6, 7 years. because there's only 2 or 3 shipyards in the United States that can actually build these things in the first place. So it's when you, I think those are the 2 strongest messages that we have seen people be, or seen our federal decision makers be receptive towards, is we need this power, it's economical, and it grows a lot of jobs near the power center, that it's actually happening. And then secondly, congressional district very far away, just let this happen, you guys are making money, just let it go. You guys are creating jobs and making money, just let it happen, you know.
That's helpful. Greg, if the next administration is favorable, what can the state do in the interim strategically to sort of set us up for the next administration?
I'll get my switch this time. So just building off what Sam was saying, so the offshore wind industry, these are oceanic numbers, so far has invested about $40 billion across 40 states in development of supply chain, investment and development of projects. So I think it's pretty clear people who work in the offshore wind industry have a full expectation these projects are going to get built. The U.S. offshore wind industry is going to thrive. It's just a matter of when can we get it there. And right now our latest hurdle is the federal administration and the challenges they're presenting. Prior to the federal administration's order on January 20th, the industry was growing and investing and building, but there were also some challenges in it, and we've all seen project attrition over the years and a bunch of other things that were going on. And so I think what we try to do at the state is, so on one hand we have a bias to action, right? We've got to take steps to try to deal with what's immediately before us. And in this case, I'm kind of referencing like the litigation that the state has started to push back on the federal administration to try to get them to lift that regulatory stop and get the process going. As Clint referenced, these projects take 12 years or so to permit, and 12 years is a pretty durable permitting timeline. And so we look forward to the opportunity to sort of working through this process to show this is a rigorous regulatory process. And I think we can all demonstrate the amount of effort, time, and expense that goes into developing the regulatory responses. On the other side, though, I think the need that we have also is to plan for the future. So how do we adapt the industry to be successful in the long run? And one of the big challenges alluded to by the gentleman on either side of me is that the time between offtake, the time that a developer submits a bid and gets awarded a contract by a state to generate the revenue they need to build the project, to finance the project, the time between that and the time that they hit financial or final investment decision and go through construction is a very long time, 12 years. And basically anything that happens in between that is at the developer's risk. So if inflation happens, if other changes happen, all of that becomes a challenge on the project economically or through a number of other means. And I think one of the things that we all need to try to work on is how can we bring those times together more closely? How can we tighten up the distance between offtake and final investment decision and construction? Because if you can eliminate the risk in that window, you can eliminate what we describe as risk premium, so the cost associated with the chance of that thing happening. And so I think one of the things that we can be working through in a planning process is how does the state partner more effectively with developers to sort of move through that process whereby the certainty is developed on both sides to get to where we can sign contracts and have projects get built pretty soon thereafter. And so I don't have all the answers on how to do it, but I think conceptually that's a way of de-risking the industry, and that's a way of bringing certainty to those projects. And as you bring certainty to the offshore projects, you bring certainty to the supply chain projects. So one of the challenges we always have with supply chain is if you're going to invest in a factory, let's just make up a number, a factory is going to cost you $500 million. You're going to invest in this factory and you've got to sell product as soon as that factory is up and running. You need to know who's going to buy your product before you invest $500 million in a factory. And so it becomes a whole timing issue, right? So if we award a developer and the developer already has their bid put together, they're going to buy the product where it makes the most sense for them. And that manufacturer is like, well, how do I get them to buy my product? On the other hand, if you wait and you've got the developer who's going to buy product and now the factory developer's got to come, he's like, well, I don't have time to build a factory now. So we've got this chicken and egg issue where the factory wants certainty of offtake of the product they manufacture before they invest, and the developers want certainty of the cost and quality of the product before they lock in their prices for the offtake. And so I think there's other ways to deal with that through, patience in state investing, through coordination with multiple state coordinations, with coordination with developers. That's another aspect of things that we need to work on. Transmission is another example of topics we have to pick up. A lot of uncertainty around the costs associated with transmission. And also, one-off radial lines, as I mentioned with the Verrazano, one-off radial lines, each project gets successively more expensive. And so finding a way to build transmission en masse is what the state's been working on. So we've got a transmission process right now with the New York ISO, and we're looking at basically separating generation from transmission in the future, allowing the transmission developers to build their transmission, offshore wind developers to build the generation. Makes a lot of sense. They're both very good at what they do, solve a whole bunch of problems, create a whole bunch of other problems, where these two pieces have to come together commercially, technically, in a timing sequence. And so you can solve a few things and create a few others. So I think working on that transmission solution is another big part of what we can do. That takes a good deal of time. It's regulated by the FERC, goes through the New York ISO, so it's a complicated process, but certainly an admirable one to try to work through to reduce risk, reduce cost. And then finally, one of the panels I was on earlier is misinformation, disinformation, education, and related. And I think part of this is what the public sees on their Facebook groups or their chats or whatever. And part of it is also in how we collect data and how we make that data available. So scientists have a really hard time explaining ourselves, right? We just get so bound up in the details that it's difficult. We need to find better ways to coordinate on data collection. We need to find better ways to tell the stories about what the data is saying. And we need to be more transparent in all of that data. And that's a big challenge. I know it's a big ask, and we have been working on that and made really good progress over the last decade or so in bringing that together. But I think continued exercise on that. So offshore wind I'm an aquatic ecologist by training, and I worked in the Great Lakes for quite a while, and the Great Lakes, we know how to run those systems. We know them inside and out. I start working with marine systems, and I'm just amazed at how little we know. And the amount of information that's been collected by investments on developers in development of their permits and other things is just remarkable. So the knowledge about what's going on in the marine space has just exploded because of offshore wind working in that space. And I think it's something that most folks don't recognize, and it's one of those things that we need to get out in front, is to educate people on that data, what it means, and how offshore wind is going to be overall a better solution than the current solution of relying on fossils and climate change. One of the big challenges we have with chasing offshore data is that climate change is just changing the system constantly. And how do you isolate the implications of one individual thing? And so I'll get off my soapbox in just one second, but when you hear folks pushing back on offshore wind, it's always about generation and the impacts of the installation and the generation side of things. Nobody wants to talk about resource extraction on the fossil fuel side, resource transportation on the fossil fuel side, and disposal of the waste thereafter. So they scope it to the thing that they can point to very easily, but there are much broader issues associated with all these other energy sources. This is certainly the most benign version of energy production that I know of.
Thank you. Clint, I'd love to turn to you. You have one of the few offshore wind permits pending before the state of New York. Can you tell us more about that and the implications of that to your project?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, let me just come back to something that both of the prior two panelists talked on, which is the overall supply-demand balance here. And Sam talked a bit about Virginia, which I think is absolutely a fascinating case study in this and something that really underscores why this is such an important resource. Virginia today, 2025, data centers comprise 25% of the total load in Virginia, and it's only growing. And so Dominion, as a rational economic actor, looked at the lay of the land and recognized that they had to find ways to get a massive amount of energy into their system very quickly to be able to supply that growing load from the digital infrastructure economy, which, by the way, is an important thing for us to lead on nationally. And what they realized from that was not just there wasn't enough power on the grid, but that they also needed a significant amount of new construction, and that it would take less time and be more cost effective to build offshore wind than it would be to build any other new form of generation in Virginia. Now, Virginia is a densely populated state, but not nearly as densely populated as we are. And so in a vertically integrated, regulated market where the operator had the choice of any technology, they made the choice of offshore wind because it was just a practical, rational economic solution. I'll give you another example. China. China is building 26 coal-fired power plants at a gigawatt scale every year. That's one every other week. And China is also the world's largest developer of offshore wind, such that if you added up the cumulative amount of all the offshore wind in the 5 next largest countries, the UK, Germany, Denmark, France, and the Netherlands, China still has more offshore wind than all of those next 5 countries and is building it at a faster rate than any of them. And for that reason, China's doing that because of the same reason that Virginia is doing it, because they need the power to be able to grow their economy. New York is not at that same level of growth, at least not yet. But as we look at those overall trends that we see playing out in those places, we see those same things at an earlier stage here in New York. Significant amount of new electric demand coming online upstate for new manufacturing like Micron, downstate from the electrification of transportation and space heating, and all across the state thanks to the digital infrastructure ecosystem. And because of that, the state's just going to need more of any form of electricity that it can get. The state's been a real leader in promoting offshore wind and other forms of renewables, and we have been investing significantly in supporting that through a number of different projects, including the one you see on the screen behind you. At this point, we're continuing to invest in advancing our project. We're taking real risk in that based on our conviction around the need for new renewables here, and yes, faith in the state of New York continuing to play a leadership role. Greg. So we do expect that this doesn't have to be a partisan issue. We recognize that it is for the time being, at least at the federal level. But ultimately, if we asked ourselves a hard question of where's the power going to come from otherwise, there's not an easier or a better solution. And at the end of the day, power is what gives us the ability to grow our economy, to be able to keep our neighborhoods safe, to be able to put food on the table. And so we have to find ways to ensure that there's enough energy that doesn't constrain the economic growth of our city and our region. And offshore wind is just a vital part of being able to do that. We could do it other ways. It would just take longer and be more cost prohibitive and have more environmental impacts.
Sorry. I want to make sure we have time for questions from the audience, so I'm just going to ask one more question, and I would love for each of you to answer this. Let's say we will have a Waterfront Conference 2030, and we will invite you back to the Waterfront Conference for 2030, 2 years after this presidential term. We will invite you to talk about the state of offshore wind and would love to hear what your key talking points would be as a part of that panel.
Go.
I'd just like to reiterate in 2030 how grateful I am for the continued strength of leadership that the state of New York has shown through these very difficult times in making hard choices to continue to support this industry. And Greg, I didn't know that you had it in you, but the spine and just the risk-taking, it was really impressive. No, seriously though, not to put Greg too much on the spot, New York has been a leader in this. Other states in the region have been a leader on it as well, not nearly as much as New York, but New York has been a real leader here. And I think that will be the thing that continues to make the difference, the extent to which states are willing to lean in. Look, the private sector is not lacking for investment opportunities and will put money behind wherever there's opportunities to develop new infrastructure. That said, we also want to be investing in things that are good and durable investments and things we can feel proud of over time. And so I think from our perspective, at least, we're continuing to make investments in the reliance on the economic principle and the leadership of the state of New York, which we hope continues.
No pressure there. Yeah, I think we at the state will continue to be dedicated to pushing this industry forward through every mechanism that we possibly have at our disposal. The investments that the state has put in, both time, effort, money, developers likewise, I think it's critical that we all work together to try to push the industry forward. There are opportunities here for both sides of the political spectrum. And I think when we come back in 2030, it's going to be really a conversation around the successes we've had, and that the emerging economy that's coming from this, and the number of folks who are working in this space. And I really look forward to the opportunity to have the public really understand the benefits associated with it and get a lot more support behind it. So I think that's our job over the next 5 years, is to sort of build this industry support and keep things moving and be able to show boots on the ground, tangible successes in that period. So it's a lot more fun talking about the folks who have jobs in offshore wind than the folks who might get a job in offshore wind when the industry is successful. I think we just need to continue to build on the successes we've had and continue to grow. So persevere and be resilient.
I think we'll be talking about the acceleration of the industry. We'll be talking about dealing with the growth. I think that, Greg was talking a lot about spending the next couple of years really putting the building blocks in place, and we'll need a very strong foundation for coming out of this period. Once we regain federal certainty in this process, that state demand hadn't gone anywhere, and it's only gotten worse. So we're going to be talking about, frankly, what we were talking about a couple of years ago, which is how do we deal with this growth? How do we install 5, 6, 7 projects all at the same time? How can our factories keep up? How can our ports keep up? And we can really help accelerate this industry in the 2030s by the work we do today.
It's really wonderful to end on that note. I really want to thank Clint, Greg, Sam for your thoughts here, and would love to open it up for the audience to see if there's any questions. Yeah.
This time when you're at a pause, are programs like that, or the things where you're kind of like, okay, maybe that's not appropriate right now to build up that talent pool, but then, say you have a more favorable administration in the future and you get your permits that you need, and so then once you have the permits and the financing, where you go deeper, I guess, or have you not even thought that far?
I think that's a great question.
Really?
You're pointing out one of the challenges. So if an individual is going to invest in training and try to learn how to be an offshore wind tech, for example, right? You don't want them to invest their time and energy in that, come out of it, and not have a job. And so this is why certainty is such a key component of this, the predictability and the certainty of the industry in terms of having projects go through construction and come online and keep going. So I think, at NYSERDA, we've supported a lot of training exercises, continue to, for training folks. Some of them are specialized things, offshore wind techs, for example. Some of them are a little less so, like we need electricians who can do lots of things, and you can adapt an electrician to do lots of things in offshore wind, welders similarly. And so I think the idea is to try to bring people into these trades that can provide the services to offshore wind, but who are also resilient to provide services to other growing industries as well. So yeah, the hope is not to have somebody quit their job, get trained to be a tech, and then have their project canceled. They're not going to work. But I think there are lots of professions that we need to grow to support the green economy and the clean energy economy. And so I think working people into those positions and then be able to draw them from other parts of industries to feed into the offshore wind as it grows is part of that ecosystem.
There's a question over here.
I'm curator and interim director of a learning center about offshore wind that is being built at the South Brooklyn Marine Terminal. I just had a question about what can be learned from other industries for the process of getting these projects done. I mean, in the US, we don't have offshore wind, but we do have offshore oil drilling, right? Even though these two industries are totally different in the respects that you've talked about here, are there lessons to be learned in terms of moving projects forward from other industries that work offshore? Basically.
I can take that. There's a significant workforce and vessels that can be leveraged from the offshore oil and gas industry. There's very little other than the physical attributes that can be, because it's an entirely different regulatory regime. So to install a offshore oil and gas well, the permitting regime is a tiny fraction of that of offshore wind. Offshore oil and gas has what's referred to as a categorical exemption from the National Environmental Policy Act review. So those projects just sail right through with almost no environmental review, whereas offshore wind requires multiple years of permitting to get a permit to do the survey work that you then need to do to spend multiple more years doing survey work to then start a multi-year permitting process to study every aspect of the project's environmental impacts, ranging from birds to worms in the dirt on the bottom of the ocean. That's no joke. And so from a process perspective, there's nothing quite like offshore wind. If there's one thing that may approach it in complexity, it's the nuclear industry, and nuclear is a very highly regulated industry, as you would hope, and those projects take a very long time to develop for exactly the same reasons that the offshore wind industry does. The problem with offshore wind is not the offshore part. The offshore part is manageable. The US has one of the finest offshore infrastructure construction industries in the entire world, one of the largest labor forces, best ports, best vessels. Like, that's not an issue. The issue is the regulatory regime that surrounds it and makes it more difficult at this point. But for, thankfully, the leadership of states like New York.
Yeah, I agree in that there isn't a good example of something you can emulate. The scale of this industry is just massive. And you can look at like transitions for solar, but those projects happen in small aliquots of 2 megawatts to 100 megawatts typically. They're somewhat larger out west, and so the scale of an individual offshore wind project is just massive, and they're done in these chunks. And the equipment that you need to move them and the port load-bearing capacity that you need to hold the components and all these things are just huge. And so it's hard to go from zero to something. We work a lot with European countries and Asian countries on understanding how they went through this process. And there is some lessons to be learned there and some things you can learn from it. But you know, they started when the turbines were 4 megawatts, right? 4 megawatts. So basically they moved a terrestrial turbine into the water and then sort of grew from there. We're jumping from nothing to 11 megawatts, right? Just big machines. One revolution powers 2 houses for a day. Like, these things are just massive. And so there isn't a good example. I think the nuclear industry is going to take lessons from the offshore wind industry when it tries to get going on how to deal with public engagement and related.
We do take a lot of scientific inspiration from the oil and gas industry. So, you know, Clinton was talking about we functionally share the same supply chain. It's essentially it is a marine construction supply chain that uses data, survey work, et cetera, to go. And there are real fast innovations happening in the oil and gas regime that we look to try to figure out how we can incorporate it into offshore wind. And it's mainly our suppliers essentially just saying like, oh, we started doing this, we're going to do this. So unmanned robotics are something that can really change the operation and maintenance procedure that would happen, which, you know, instead of doing manual inspections all the time, you just send out a robot and you have 100 you know, right now it just has one oil and gas well to look at, but now you have 100 turbines that just goes zzz, and just goes up and down. Eventually, New York will get into floating offshore wind, and we are seeing copious amounts of designs for floating foundations coming from oil and gas engineers because they've been doing deep water exploration for so long. And frankly, they're super excited to get into this industry. So we have way more designs than we have the ability to even like serialize or even standardize any of them. So completely right about the regulatory regime, but especially from the supply chain, we do spend a lot of time in Houston, for example, and trying to bring those companies in as a way that we hope would lower the cost of doing business and lower the cost of power. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. We are now at time, and I'm sorry that we can't take any more questions, but they will be here afterwards. And if you have any other questions, please feel free to talk to Clint, Greg, or Sam. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate your time and your insights. It is absolutely wonderful to hear that there is a chart forward and a path forward. And you know, Waterfront Alliance will always be there to support with offshore wind moving forward. So thank you all for being here, and we really appreciate your time.